My name is Gabriel Navarro, and there's one night I'll never forget. Christmas Eve, at my parents' farmhouse in Vermont. The snow outside was piled high, wrapping the house in silence, but inside the kitchen, laughter and cheers shook the walls. At the head of the table, my younger brother Ethan held up a Tesla key fob, grinning like a kid on his birthday. My parents clapped so hard, I thought their hands would break. "You deserve it, Ethan. You've worked so hard." I sat quietly, waiting my turn. In front of me sat a small cardboard box. I peeled back the wrapping paper, half hoping, half dreading. Inside was a slow cooker, a clearance sticker still dangling from the cord. "For all those nights you eat alone," Mom said casually, sipping her wine. The room erupted with laughter. Ethan smirked at me from across the table. I forced a smile, but inside, my chest tightened. My throat burned. I had driven 8 hours from Boston, rehearsing my big news. I had just been promoted to lead architect, overseeing a museum project that would define my career. But I knew, staring at that clearance tag slow cooker, that if I spoke, they wouldn't listen. They never did. That gift wasn't just a present. It was proof. Proof that in my family's eyes, I would always be invisible. I wish I could tell you that Christmas Eve was the first time my parents made me feel invisible. But the truth is, it was just the last straw in a lifetime of being treated like the extra child. Growing up in Vermont, my family's farmhouse always felt like two different worlds under one roof. Ethan's world, where every achievement, big or small, was celebrated with balloons, cake, and endless praise. And then there was mine. Quiet, overlooked, dismissed. When Ethan scored 3 points in his high school basketball game, Mom invited the entire neighborhood for a celebration. When I graduated top of my class, earning a full scholarship to study architecture in Boston, my parents sent me a text that read, "Good job. Don't forget to call your brother." That was the rhythm of my childhood. Ethan the golden boy, me the reliable shadow. But what made it worse wasn't just the lack of recognition, it was the expectations. I was always the one told to help Ethan out, to be the responsible one, to clean up his messes when he screwed up. He flunked his college classes? I was asked to lend him money for summer courses. He crashed Dad's truck? I was told to take on extra work to cover repairs. And the sickest part? I did it. Every time. Because I thought maybe, just maybe, if I kept proving myself useful, one day, they'd finally see me. But sitting at that Christmas table with a clearance slow cooker in my lap and a Tesla parked in the driveway for Ethan, something in me broke. That night, while my parents toasted Ethan's bright future and laughed about his new car, I slipped away. I locked myself in the upstairs bathroom and stared into the mirror. For the first time, I didn't see their responsible son. I didn't see the reliable one, the forgotten one. I saw a man who had been taken for granted his entire life. And I made myself a promise, right there, staring at my own hollow reflection under the buzzing bathroom light. I wasn't going to play their game anymore. When I came out of that bathroom on Christmas night, my face felt stiff, like I was wearing a mask. My parents didn't notice, of course they didn't. They were too busy laughing with Ethan about where he'd take his Tesla for its first spin. I sat back down at the table, nodding at their stories, pretending to sip my wine. Inside, though, something had shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. That night, after everyone went to bed, I stayed awake in my childhood room. The posters were still on the wall, the creaky wooden desk still sat in the corner. It was like my parents had frozen me in time, like I'd never grown up. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl against the farmhouse windows, and I thought about how many years I'd wasted waiting for scraps of love. And then I decided I wasn't going to wait anymore. At 3 in the morning, I quietly stuffed my backpack. A couple of shirts, my laptop, the stack of design sketches I never showed anyone. I left behind the ugly sweater my mom gave me, the clearance slow cooker, everything that tied me to their version of me. I crept down the stairs, careful to avoid the one that always groaned under pressure. For a second, I stood in the living room, looking at the family photos covering the mantel. Ethan in his basketball jersey, Ethan with his prom date, Ethan holding up his driver's license. My own picture was there too, tucked in the corner, half hidden behind a ceramic angel. I felt a bitter smile creep across my face. That photo said it all. I grabbed my coat, slipped into the freezing Vermont night, and walked away. No dramatic farewell, no confrontation, just silence. When I reached the end of the long gravel driveway, I turned back. The farmhouse windows glowed warm in the distance, like a life I had been locked out of since the day I was born. I whispered under my breath, "Goodbye," and then I kept walking. That night wasn't just me leaving home, it was me leaving the shadow they'd built for me. The bus ride from Vermont to Boston felt endless, but for the first time in my life, I didn't mind being uncomfortable. My knees ached from the cramped seat, my backpack dug into my shoulders, and my stomach growled because I hadn't eaten since dinner. But every mile that put distance between me and that farmhouse felt like oxygen filling my lungs. When the city lights finally appeared on the horizon, I pressed my forehead against the window and just stared. Boston, a place where nobody knew me, where I wasn't Ethan's shadow, where my parents' disappointment couldn't follow me around like a ghost. I checked into the cheapest hostel I could find. Tiny room, thin sheets, squeaky bed. It smelled faintly of bleach, but to me, it smelled like freedom. I lay down and laughed quietly to myself. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The first week was survival. I stretched every dollar I had. Instant ramen, peanut butter sandwiches, coffee from gas stations. I walked instead of taking the train, partly to save money, and partly because every street felt like discovery. I'd wander for hours, sketchbook tucked under my arm, drawing the city's fire escapes, its busy markets, the way the light bounced off skyscraper glass. And for the first time, I wasn't drawing to impress anyone. I wasn't chasing approval. I was just creating. For me, I found work quickly. Not glamorous, but enough. A late-night diner took me in as a dishwasher. The pay was lousy, the shifts long, but the manager didn't ask questions. And that was exactly what I needed: anonymity, a place to rebuild in peace. Some nights, after my shift, I'd sit by the Charles River with my sketchbook. The city lights shimmered on the water, and the cold air bit at my fingers. But I didn't care. Sitting there, I felt like I was finally breathing. Of course, the freedom wasn't perfect. There were nights I cried quietly into my pillow, nights when loneliness hit harder than hunger. There were mornings when my hands trembled from exhaustion, when I questioned if I'd made the right choice walking away. But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of that Christmas dinner. The way my mother's eyes lit up for Ethan, and how mine never seemed to catch her gaze. That memory became my anchor. Whenever I thought of turning back, it reminded me why I left. Boston wasn't home yet, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, I realized, are worth the hunger, the loneliness, the fear. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in someone else's story. I was writing my own. Freedom was intoxicating, but it was also terrifying. Every day I woke up knowing that nobody was going to save me, nobody was going to bail me out if I failed. I had no family safety net, no one to call if rent was late or if I got sick. It was all on me, and strangely enough, that truth lit a fire inside me. After a couple of months of scrubbing dishes and saving every dollar I could, I decided it was time to push myself. I couldn't live in the shadows of a diner forever. So one afternoon, with my hands still raw from bleach water, I took my sketchbook to a local art gallery. I didn't have a plan, just hope. I walked around the exhibits, trying not to feel small as people in tailored coats sipped wine and talked about brushstrokes like they were decoding scripture. But then, something happened. A woman in her 30s noticed me sketching one of the displayed sculptures in the corner. She approached me, curious. "You're talented," she said, peering at my sketch. "Where did you study?" The truth burned on my tongue. Nowhere. My parents never supported me. I was invisible at home. But instead, I said softly, "I haven't studied formally. I just draw." Her name was Clara, and she worked as an assistant curator. Unlike most people in that room, she didn't laugh at my rough edges. She asked questions. She listened. And before leaving, she gave me her card. "There's an open call for local artists next month. You should try." That night, I stared at the card like it was a lifeline. I knew I wasn't ready. My work wasn't polished, my confidence fragile, but something in me refused to let the chance slip, so I poured myself into it. Every spare hour after work was spent sketching, experimenting, failing, and starting again. Weeks later, I submitted 3 pieces. My hands trembled as I handed them in. I half expected to get laughed out of the room, but to my shock, one was accepted. The gallery didn't pay much, but it paid me something I'd never had before: validation. For once, someone saw me not as Ethan's brother, not as the forgotten son, but as me. That small success rippled. I met other local artists, people who lived like me on the edge of survival but fueled by passion. They became my circle, my makeshift family. We shared food when one of us couldn't afford groceries, shared laughter in cramped apartments, shared advice when doubt crept in. And slowly, I began to see that blood wasn't the only thing that made a family. Looking back, it wasn't the gallery show that changed me the most. It was the realization that I wasn't alone anymore. I had people who wanted me around, not because they had to, but because they chose to. It was the first brick in the foundation of the life I was building. A life that was mine, and mine alone. The night of my first gallery showing, I thought no one would show up for me. I stood in the corner, fidgeting with my jacket sleeves, waiting for people to glance at my sketch and move on like it was background noise. But then, it happened. A couple stopped in front of my piece, a portrait I'd drawn of an elderly man on a park bench, eyes heavy with stories unspoken. They lingered. The woman tilted her head, her voice soft with surprise. "This feels alive." That moment stretched out like an eternity. People weren't just looking at my work, they were feeling it. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. By the end of the night, I'd sold my piece for a modest sum. Not much, but it felt like I'd been handed a crown. That sale meant validation, progress, proof that I wasn't delusional chasing this dream. Word started spreading in small circles. Clara introduced me to other curators. One of the artists from my circle invited me to collaborate on a mural project. Suddenly, opportunities trickled in, tiny, fragile, but real. And then came the twist I wasn't ready for. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I saw a notification that made my stomach tighten. A tag. Someone had posted a picture of me standing next to my sketch at the gallery. They'd written, "Incredible emerging artist, Gabriel Navarro." It should have been pure joy, but my first thought was, my family is going to see this. And I was right. Not even a week later, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't seen in months. "Ethan, so you're an artist now? Funny, I don't remember you having any talent when we were growing up. Guess pity projects sell these days." I stared at the message, heat rising in my chest. Out of everything he could have said, even indifference would have hurt less. But no, he went straight for the kill, reminding me that in his eyes, I was still beneath him. And then my mother called. Her voice, sugar-sweet but sharp underneath. "Gabriel, why didn't you tell us about this? You know, if you had stayed with us, we could have helped you. Imagine how much further you'd be with our support. Why keep secrets from your family?" I almost laughed out loud. Support? The same people who shut their doors in my face now wanted credit for my survival? I hung up quickly, making some excuse about being busy. But that night, as I lay in bed, a knot of rage and fear twisted inside me. They weren't proud of me. They weren't happy for me. They just wanted to pull me back in to control the narrative, to remind me that even my success should orbit around them. It was the first sign that my family wasn't going to stay gone, and deep down, I knew this wasn't just about art anymore. This was going to be a battle for my life, my identity, and the freedom I'd fought so hard for. If the texts and calls had been the first warning shots, what happened next was an all-out ambush. It started small. At the next family gathering, a cousin's wedding I didn't attend, I heard later from a mutual friend that Ethan and my mother had turned me into the night's entertainment. Over glasses of champagne, they told everyone I was dabbling in silly sketches because I couldn't handle real responsibility. Poor Gabriel, my mother had apparently sighed. one hand pressed to her chest like she was grieving. "He thinks drawing strangers will pay the bills. We tried to raise him right, but some kids just can't be saved." The way it was relayed to me, people laughed. Some nodded with pity, others just shrugged. I wasn't there, but it felt like I was standing in the middle of that dance floor, naked under the weight of their ridicule. Then came the real slap in the face. A week later, I found out Ethan had been at a networking event with local business owners, and when my name came up because one of my art pieces had been displayed in a nearby cafe, he had the nerve to laugh. "Oh, Gabriel? Yeah, he's trying this starving artist thing. Always was the black sheep. Honestly, if you want real work, call me." That line spread fast. People started associating me with the phrase, starving artist. Not in a sympathetic way, but in a dismissive, belittling way. And it didn't stop there. I noticed fake reviews popping up on social media. Subtle but cutting. "Saw his stuff. Amateur at best. Tries too hard to be deep, but it's all messy sketches. Wouldn't waste money on this." I knew who was behind it. The phrasing was too familiar, the insults too personal. My family wasn't content just ignoring me anymore. They were sabotaging me, trying to strangle my reputation before it could grow. The irony was bitter. For years, I begged for their validation. Now that I had validation from strangers, they were desperate to erase it. And the worst part? A part of me almost let them win. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they were right. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I was fooling myself, dragging out a fantasy because I couldn't face reality. But every time doubt tried to bury me, I remembered the look on that woman's face in the gallery, the way her eyes had softened, the way she'd said, "This feels alive." That wasn't fake. That wasn't a lie. Still, the damage was real. Jobs I'd lined up suddenly went quiet. People who had seemed enthusiastic pulled back, their replies curt and delayed. I could feel the whispers working against me, circling like vultures. And that's when the anger settled in, not a flash, but a steady burn. They wanted me to crawl back, to admit they were right, to beg for forgiveness, to let them claim ownership of me again. But instead, I started planning, because if they thought they could keep me small, they had no idea what I was capable of when I had nothing left to lose. The breaking point didn't arrive with a bang. It crept in quietly, like rot spreading through wood. That night, as I sat in my cramped studio, the glow of my phone casting sharp shadows across the floor, Ethan's cruel comments stared back at me. "This guy's family doesn't even respect him. Why would anyone else?" For a second, I felt the old panic, the choking, suffocating fear that they might be right, that I was just pretending, that I was still the boy begging at their door, desperate for scraps of approval. But then, something shifted. I thought about every fake smile at the wedding, every backhanded compliment, every door slammed in my face, and I realized my family had built their power on my silence, on me shrinking, on me doubting. And if silence was their weapon, then my voice would be mine. So, I began collecting ammunition. I took screenshots of every fake review, lined them up in folders, categorized by date and username. I archived Ethan's text messages and the smirking emojis he tacked on like daggers. I reached out to people who'd heard their gossip at gatherings one by one. They admitted the cruel things my family had said, and some even agreed to put it in writing. For once, the truth wasn't floating around in my head as whispers of pain. I had it, tangible, solid, but I knew exposing them with words alone wasn't enough. I wanted them to feel what they had done to me. So I turned to the only language I knew how to speak fluently: art. My hands became machines, my sketchbook a battlefield. I sketched faceless figures suffocating under heavy words like failure and useless. I painted hands familiar, parental hands pressing children's shoulders down into the dirt. I drew families gathered around dinner tables where one chair sat empty, marked unworthy. Each piece was raw, jagged and dark. Not polished, not pretty, but honest. Clara noticed immediately. When she visited my studio one evening, she stood frozen in front of a half-finished canvas of a man drowning while people on the shore pointed and laughed. "Gabriel," she whispered, her eyes shining, This isn't just art. This is testimony. Her words lit a fire in me. Together, we started building the idea. A solo exhibition, stripped of glamour, dripping with truth. We called it Voices That Break You. But here's where my revenge sharpened. This wasn't just going to be an anonymous showcase. No, I was going to connect the dots, subtly, carefully, but unmistakably. I planned to include fragments of real text messages integrated into the artwork. Ethan's mocking, starving artist lines scrawled across the canvas of a faceless figure begging for scraps. My mother's words, "Why keep secrets from your family?" etched into the background of a painting of a locked cage. To outsiders, it would look like a universal story about toxic families. But to those who knew me, to them it would be undeniable. My art would expose them without me ever saying their names. And here's the genius. The more they tried to deny it, the guiltier they'd look. For weeks, I worked like a man possessed. My knuckles cracked, my wrists ached, but the rage kept fueling me. I barely ate, I barely slept. Coffee and fury carried me through each night. Meanwhile, my family carried on in ignorance. Ethan bragged online about his successful career. My mother posted about being a martyr of difficult children. They had no idea that while they were laughing, I was sharpening my knives. By the time I stepped back and looked at the collection, a dozen canvases heavy with pain and defiance, I didn't feel small anymore. I felt dangerous. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was war. And the gallery showing wasn't going to be an exhibition. It was going to be an execution. The night the gallery doors opened, I felt like I was walking into the belly of whatever had been stalking me my whole life. The streetlight glinting on the wet pavement, the muffled hum of people's shoes. The gallery's brass plaque reflecting a word I'd dreamed of for years, but never expected to see next to my name. Exhibit. I arrived early, hands steady for the first time in months. My palms no longer trembled when I touched the frames. I had rehearsed how I would enter the room, where I would stand, and, most importantly, how I would let the artwork do the talking. Clara was already there, checking placement, adjusting the lighting so that each canvas ate the light and didn't let it go. She gave me a nod, small, ironclad. That nod felt like armor. People started coming. Friends, curious neighbors, a couple of local art bloggers, one old university professor who'd always believed I had a voice under the blueprints. They mingled and smiled like the world was smooth and polite and safe. They had no idea the knives sewn into the hems of my dresses. I'd arranged the space deliberately. The first piece, a cracked piggy bank, painted with my childhood nickname in bright, mocking letters, hung by the entrance. It was small and ridiculous looking, the kind of object the room would dismiss quickly. That was the point. Like the first hint of a cold spread, people would move through it and not see the disease until it had wrapped its fingers around their throats. As the room filled, the first reveal landed quietly. A woman in a red coat paused by the piggy bank painting and read the small printed text beneath it. I'd included captions, factual, clinical lines, dates, receipts, little details that would read like bullet points to strangers, but would sting like lived memories to those who knew the truth. She frowned, then tapped her phone, and I could see the headline forming on her lips. The thumbnails of social feeds began to pulse in the room like heartbeats. The second reveal came 15 minutes later. I had installed a projector in the far corner that flicked silent, grainy video loops against a blank wall. Texts, voicemails, paper receipts sliding across a scanner. That feed cycled through without names but with unmistakable context. Emptying the joint account, LOL, scrolled across a phone screenshot. The room quieted. I watched people lean in. Curiosity curdled into comprehension on their faces. I felt a surge of something bright and hot, not triumph alone but the complicated heat of vindication and sorrow braided together. Each time someone's expression changed, confusion, then disbelief, then shame. I felt like a bell had rung somewhere inside me. And then the test. I hadn't invited them. My family was not on the RSVP list. I'd told myself it would be cowardly to bait them. But as the night swirled and the small crowd thickened, I heard the shoes. My father's muttered cough. My mother's light, practiced laugh. Chelsea's perfume, a note too sweet against the gallery's solvent smell. They slipped into the back, as if looking for the cheapest seat in their own theater, eyes scanning until they found me. The moment of contact was smaller than I'd imagined. No dramatic reveal at the podium, no thunderous music, just my father standing behind a cluster of viewers, pausing as if to sip the atmosphere and then freezing as he read the caption beneath a painting. I had placed one of the most personal pieces near the center, a large canvas of a dinner table, chairs empty except for one small chair with a piggy bank on it. Surrounding that centerpiece, I'd printed a collage, bank statements, snippets of birthday cards, dates of payments, and the receipts for travel that didn't have my name on them. I'd blurred any names that would make the piece legally risky, but the pattern was impossible to deny. My father's shoulders tightened. I watched his hand go to his mouth. He moved away from the cluster, a little unsteady, as if someone had punched him in the sternum. Chelsea, meanwhile, laughed, at first the automatic laugh of someone who has always assumed she's untouchable. But the laughter broke into a cough as she read the line I'd plastered across the lower right corner. A child's worth can be measured in gifts. Her face contorted not with outrage, but with a private panic I'd never seen before. My mother's hand flew to her chest and then to a table where a brochure lay open. She read the caption aloud, her voice losing its practiced softness. I kept a $2 bill for every week she left. The room shifted like tectonic plates. Conversations stuttered. Phones came out. People photographed. Stories began to sprout wings. I could have spoken then. I could have marched to the center and read the receipts aloud. But I let the art speak. Let the paper shout. Let the receipts betray them better than any confession. And then the coup de grâce, the final evidence reveal. The strike that would make denial look like cowardice. I'd arranged a quiet corner with a looped audio installation, a series of voicemail excerpts I'd collected over the months, softened so they wouldn't be legally incendiary, but clear enough to make intent audible. I didn't need to broadcast every nasty thing, just a few clipped phrases. You always were the responsible one, like $2 in a piggy bank. I don't know why you're so dramatic. We can't have you embarrassing the family. You'll be fine. We didn't have money for you then. Why expect it now? Voices layered, the cadence of guilt pure and naked. As the audio drifted through the gallery, I watched my father's face change from anger to something like grief. My mother's lip quivered. She reached for my father's arm and he pulled away. I felt a small, ridiculous urge to applaud like the rest of the room, not the art, but myself, for the audacity to build a battlefield out of truth. But something deeper happened. My brother slid toward me, eyes rimmed, and for the first time that night his voice softened as he murmured, "I didn't know." Those words weren't an absolution. They were not an apology, but they were a seam opening. After the exhibition, social media did the rest. Local blogs ran pieces. New show turns private family pain into public conversation. People shared photos, tagged friends, and for a week, my name trended through circles I'd never touched. But the real work had already begun in the private messages that arrived afterward, calls from distant relatives, admitting they'd always wondered. An aunt who confessed to having buckets of receipts of favors my parents had sent to Chelsea over the years. A cousin who said he'd testify if anything went to court. A week after the show, a concise legal letter arrived at my mother's house. It was short, merciless in its civility. A request for an accounting of family funds over the last 20 years, and an offer to mediate or proceed formally. My parents hired a lawyer, of course, and their lawyer called mine within 48 hours. The fallout wasn't a collapse. People don't fall in tidy cinematic arcs. It was worse and better, messy, public, and ultimately clarifying. My family needed to answer questions. They were forced to reckon in public spaces with patterns they'd normalized in private. Neighbors who once averted their eyes now asked hard questions. The narrative that had been neat and comfortable for them. We are a close family. Children take different paths, looked threadbare under the light. For me, the payoff came slow. The first time I slept all night without waking in a sweat was not the night of applause. It was 2 months later, After a mediation, where a settlement acknowledged past financial imbalances and established trusteeship for future family distributions, it wasn't perfect and it wasn't total. I did not want to destroy anyone. I wanted fairness and accountability. In the months after, my parents enrolled in therapy. My brother took a leave from work. He texted me once saying, "I'm starting to see now." It was not enough to erase years, but it was a start. And for the first time in my life, when I sat down at family holiday tables in the years that followed, it was not with the nagging question of whether I'd been forgotten. Other people's expectations had shifted. My voice had weight. My boundaries were, finally, respected. They say revenge eats you if you let it. They were right about one thing. If revenge becomes your whole diet, you shrivel. But in that gallery, my revenge was surgical. It wasn't to make them suffer more than they deserved. It was to show them what their small cruelties looked like when magnified and given shape. It was to claim my value publicly, to translate a lifetime of whispered diminishment into a ledger that could not be ignored. People still talk about that night. Some call it catharsis, some a spectacle. For me, it was reclamation. A bookends moment that closed a chapter of quiet shrinking and opened a new volume where I could be loud enough to matter. On my mantel now sits a small glass frame with a single $2 bill folded inside. Not a trophy, not a taunt, a reminder of what I refused to accept and what I chose to become instead. When my brother called months later and asked if we could have coffee, I said yes. I wasn't naive about the work ahead, but the coffee came without strings attached. It came with him listening, and in that listening, I found the last small proof I'd needed, that people can change when shown the truth, even if it comes from the one they once dismissed. The exhibition had been the final reveal to the world. The harder, quieter work was what came after. Repair, boundary setting, and the slow, steady building of a life that did not require anyone else's permission to be whole. When the gallery night ended, I thought I'd feel nothing but triumph. I thought watching my father's face crack under the weight of his own shame would finally make me feel whole. And yes, for a brief moment, it was sweet, vindicating. Like I'd clawed my way out of the shadows and stood under the spotlight I had been denied my entire life. But life doesn't pause after revenge. The next morning, reality hit. My phone buzzed nonstop. People from the neighborhood, old classmates, even distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Some messages were supportive. "You finally got your moment, Gabriel. You deserve it." Others were sharper. "Did you really have to humiliate your own father like that?" And that's when the real weight of my choice started to settle in. When I came back to my apartment, it was dead quiet. My mother had seen everything. She stood in that gallery, tears in her eyes, caught between her husband and her son. For days afterward, she didn't call me. And when she finally did, her voice trembled. "Gabriel, why didn't you tell me?" That question pierced deeper than all of my father's years of dismissals. I had fought so hard to be seen, but in the process, I had kept my own mother in the dark. I realized my revenge hadn't just cut into him, it had cut into her too. The art community split right down the middle. Some galleries reached out, eager to feature me, saying my work carried raw honesty. Others quietly distanced themselves, wary of associating with family scandal. My father? He retreated. Word spread that he canceled his next exhibition. Rumors swirled about sponsors pulling out. For a man who thrived on reputation, silence became his prison. But here's the truth. That silence didn't give me peace. Instead, it echoed with a question, had I become just as ruthless as him? Weeks later, I got an unexpected call. It was my younger cousin, Diego. He whispered into the phone, "Gabriel, thank you. You showed me that we don't have to let them keep us invisible." That's when it clicked. My revenge wasn't just about punishing my father. It was about breaking the cycle of silence and favoritism that our whole family had normalized. I had been the scapegoat for so long, but by stepping out, I'd given others the courage to step out too. That, more than humiliation, became my closure. I won't lie and pretend everything tied up neatly with a bow. My relationship with my father is fractured, maybe beyond repair. My mother and I still walk a fragile line. But for the first time in my life, my name Gabriel Navarro stands on its own. Not as his son, not as the forgotten child, but as myself. I finally learned that revenge is just one part of the story. What really matters is what you build after the fire. And for me, that's a life where I refuse to be invisible again. So if you've ever been the forgotten one, the scapegoat, the child who never got chosen, let my story remind you, you don't have to stay in the shadows forever. Sometimes, you have to burn the script they wrote for you and write your own.
Thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this, go watch the one on the left and don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel for more tales of triumph over injustice and a saga of ultimate revenge.